Hello, everyone. So what I want to talk with you about in this brief video is something that I just refer to simply as TPQDA, or Topic, Problem, Questions, Data, and Analysis. This is incredibly important in any research study that you design and implement, but especially so in quantitative research studies. And so that's going to be my focus as I talk through these few slides in the next few minutes. So we're going to start off with the topic. The topic is obviously the topic of your study, the area or the phenomenon that you are investigating in your research study. The topic as you approach it should be broad. I like to think of this as sort of the 30,000 foot view of the phenomenon that you're studying. When you describe the topic, one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is that you demonstrate a concern or need for this research to be conducted. You want to build on this from previous research studies and the recommendations that other researchers have made for the need for a study, but also incorporating your own personal experiences as a practitioner or somebody who has worked in the field and has encountered this problem or topic or phenomenon that you want to study. It should hold some degree of personal interest. And the reason that I say it is because when you conduct any kind of research study, you have to invest a good amount of time. And it has to hold your personal interest. You don't want to get bored with the topic halfway through conducting a research study because you'll never finish it. You also want to consider things like manageability and time. Are you able to manage the design of the study that you want to implement? Are you comfortable engaging in the kind of study that you want to conduct? Also, do you have the time to conduct that sort of a study? All different studies, all different methodologies have different requirements and require different time commitments and constraints on things like ethics and other things. And so they all have to be factored in to your process and thinking when you frame a topic for a research study. Next, let's move on to the problem, also known as the problem statement. So the problem statement is really a restatement of the topic. So when you provided the 30,000 foot view of your topic, you're now going to succinctly state the problem that you are investigating in your study. This is, when I say succinct, I mean really succinct. Your description of your topic might span several pages in a research study or a dissertation or a thesis, something like that. But the problem statement is succinct. It is usually one sentence that describes the problem or the topic that you're studying. We do this because it helps the researcher to narrow the focus of the research study and also to sort of limit the scope of the topic. Otherwise, it can sort of take off in all sorts of divergent directions. It also helps to focus the attention of a reader of your dissertation, thesis, research study, what have you. The next portion of what we're looking at are your research questions, the next logical step. So these are specific questions that are posed by you, the researcher, that you intend to answer through the conduct of your study and as a result of the data that you collect and the data that you analyze. The research questions provide specific direction for your research. The research questions are the things that guide your data collection and analysis. In fact, they will also guide the development and your discussion of your conclusions at the end. Everything in your study is based on and around the research questions. So again, these are the questions that you're going to answer with the data that you collect and that you analyze, regardless of whether you're collecting quantitative data, qualitative data, or mixed methods sorts of data. Usually within those research questions, we identify the major variables that we're focusing our attention on in the study. And again, those things are going to come out of your discussion of the topic as well as your problem statement. I'm going to give you some very quick guidelines for the development of research questions. First of all, avoid yes/no questions. The reason that I say this is because typically we want to know a lot more about a phenomenon other than a simple yes or no answer. The data that we collect hopefully is going to take us much deeper into describing responses or answers to those research questions. And yes, no answers don't cut it. They're not deep enough. They have to be researchable. What I mean when I say that is we have to be able to collect data on those variables in order to be able to answer the specific questions that we posed. And then finally, we want to make sure that we don't already assume an answer in the statement of the question. Okay, we need for the questions to be objective. As we approach a research study as a researcher, we want to do that objectively. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of research questions and sort of a quick discussion about what's wrong with each of these questions. So here's the first question. Is there a relationship between students' academic performance and the number of hours spent studying? So the main thing that's wrong with that question is that it is stated in a yes-no fashion. Is there a relationship? So the answer to that question is either yes or no. But that's not really what we want to know. We want to know what the kind of relationship is. What's the nature of the relationship? Is it a positive relationship, a negative relationship? How strong is the relationship? So oftentimes we might restate that as what is the nature of the relationship between students' academic performance, etc. The second question, what will improve students' critical thinking skills? Now, this question to me is simply not researchable because it's so open-ended and so broad, it doesn't have any focus, right? So what will improve students' critical thinking skills? There could be thousands of things, but we don't want to look at thousands of things in our study. We might want to look at one or two things. So what we would want to say in that question is, will XYZ improve students' critical thinking skills? Okay, or to what extent will they improve those critical thinking skills? The next question, does God exist? As a research question. Now, I'm not going to get into theological debates with anyone, but from a research perspective, that is not a good research question because I don't know what possible data you would collect that would answer the question, does God exist? Now, if this is a topic that we want to explore and investigate through a research study, I might suggest rewording the question so that it is something that is researchable, something upon which we could collect data. For example, do people believe that God exists? To what extent do people believe that God exists? Things like that, because I can collect data, I can identify and collect data to answer that question. And then finally, to what extent will the integration of technology into the writing process improve students' writing skills? Okay, what's wrong with this question? It is already assuming an answer. It's assuming that if I integrate technology into the writing process, I'm going to improve student skills. Okay, so I'm already partially assuming an answer to that question before I even conduct the research study. A better way to word that question might be, to what extent will the integration of technology into the writing process impact student writing skills, affect student writing skills? Notice that that doesn't imply an improvement or a decrease in performance. It's wide open to whichever I find in the research study. Excuse me. And then a quick note about hypotheses. Hypotheses are typically only used in research studies where we are utilizing inferential statistical procedures to analyze data. All right. We use research questions in any and all research studies, but only include hypotheses if we are going to be using inferential statistics or hypothesis testing as a means of analyzing those data. So just something for you to keep in mind. Next on the list is data. Just a quick side note, always remember that the word data is plural. In every sense, it is plural. So write about it in the plural form, okay? So when we think about data and alignment in a research study, the data that we collect must provide the information that we need to answer the research questions. So often I see people identify research questions, but then propose to collect data that really have nothing to do with the research questions. It might be interesting data, but when you get to the end of the study, analyzing those data will not allow you to answer those questions because you haven't collected data on the variables that you identified in the research questions. Okay, so you want to make sure that the data that you're planning to collect will directly provide you the information that you need in order to answer those research questions. If you don't plan to use all the data that you are thinking about collecting in order to answer questions, then don't collect those data. Don't collect data just because you can, if you're not even going to use them. The main reason that I say that is because really it's twofold. One, it creates more work for you as the researcher. But two, if you're collecting data from participants, human beings, participants in your study, that requires more of them to provide data to you when you're not even going to use those data. So don't waste everybody's time in collecting data that you aren't going to use. Also keep in mind that all of these things are decisions that have to be made at the outset of the research process. These are not things that we decide after we've begun to implement the study. These are all decisions that have to be made before we actually implement any sort of formalized research study. And then finally, data analysis. The choices that we make for how we're going to analyze our data must also correspond to the purpose of the study, the research questions that we've stated, and the data that we have identified to collect. All right, we have to have that alignment. If they don't align with those things, then they will not provide answers to the questions that we posed at the beginning of our study, which makes those analyses counterproductive. They don't give us the answers that we need. Okay, as quick, a quick sort of explanation or example of that. If I'm talking about comparisons between students who are exposed to a new instructional strategy and those who are not, so in other words, I have to look at a difference between two groups. One thing that I would not want to propose to use as a method of analysis would be the computation of a correlation coefficient, which describes the relationship between two variables. Those things do not align with one another, okay? And then a final piece of advice related to data analysis that I always give to everyone is, as much as possible, try to stay within your data analysis comfort zone. Don't pick advanced analyses that you think will impress other people, because if you don't know how to conduct those analyses or accurately interpret the results, you aren't going to impress anybody by doing that. So stay within your comfort zone. Okay? I'm going to give you a quick example of how all of this sort of looks and fits together. Now, this is an example of a research study that I conducted a few years ago and have since presented at conferences and published in journals. The title of that study was, or is, Online EDD Program Graduates' Persistence for Engaging in Ongoing Practitioner Research. So the topic that I proposed to study was that in doctoral programs, we teach research skills to all students. But the question that I really wanted to sort of investigate is, to what extent do graduates continue to do research after they finish their doctoral programs? There's a very small amount of research available on that topic. Now, in the paper that I presented at a conference and that I published, that discussion of that topic is about 3 or 4 double-spaced pages. Okay? But then here is the problem statement that I actually posed. We teach and expect doc graduates to conduct research after program completion, but we really don't know if, the extent, or under what conditions they may do so. So that was the problem statement that I was investigating in that study. Here were the 4 research questions that I posed, and I'm just going to read through them to you quickly, but you can sort of see, hopefully, how I've abided by the guidelines that I presented to you earlier. Number 1, what are the ongoing perceptions held by graduates of an online EDD program regarding the use of action research in their workplace context? Number 2, how and to what extent are graduates of an online EDD program continuing to engage in the process of conducting their own action research studies? Number 3, What aspects of the action research process or of their workplace context either encourage or discourage the use of action research as a problem-solving strategy? And finally, what differences in graduates' perceptions of or use of action research exist between different demographic groups? So the data that I collected for this study all came from a self-reported perceptions survey in the form of the graduates' responses to an online survey where there were 49 forced choice items, 49 items that had scales, right? Like a Likert scale or Likert type scale. And then 5 open-ended items where they provided their own explanations of what I was asking them. The analyses or analytical strategies that I chose for those data included descriptive statistics, chi-square tests for independence, because those looked at the relationships between item responses and demographic groups. And then I used some inductive coding and analysis for the open-ended items. So this was a mixed methods study where I collected both qualitative and quantitative data in an attempt to answer all 4 of those research questions. So I'm just going to wrap up with the bottom line. When we look at TPQDA, topic, problem, questions, data, and analysis, all 5 of those items have to thoroughly be thought out and explicitly stated in advance of the implementation of any research study. The bottom line is that all 5 of those aspects have to be parallel. They have to be aligned throughout your study. If they are not, at some point during the conduct of your study, you will run into problems with respect to data, analysis, answering questions, drawing conclusions, whatever the case may be. Okay? So as you begin to plan out any sort of research study, dissertations, theses, research studies as a practitioner, one of the things that you should always do is jot down these 5 letters, these 5 initials, TPQDA, and plan your study according to your specifications of what each of those things would look like in your study. That will help to guarantee that you will have that alignment, which will make the conduct and the completion of your study a lot more smooth. Thanks.